Indian Wells is a small pool of spring water. Year-round, as it has for perhaps thousands of years, it seeps from the ground in a narrow depression on the side of a low, rocky hill. Indian Wells lies on the edge of what is today called the Indian Wells Valley. The valley, some 25 miles long and 15 miles across, lies on the northern edge of the Mojave Desert. And the Mojave Desert itself lies on the outermost edge of civilization. The valley, named for this spring, where the occasional desert traveler stopped to rest and drink the precious water, has become home to more than 30,000 people. This is a story about the Indian Wells Valley and the people who have called it home.
There were 4 main Indian groups that may have used this area. The Kauai-Sioux, the Panamint Shoshone, the Owens Valley Paiute, and the Tabata-Labal. They crossed the valley. They used some of the springs that are on the edges of the valley.
Traces of these early visitors are found throughout the Indian Wells Valley and the surrounding hills and canyons. To archaeologist Youngkin, they tell the tale of a seasonal existence in a valley where temperatures can range from over 110 degrees in the summer to near 0 in the winter, and where the wind can blow relentlessly for days and days on end.
There were hard times late in the winter, early in the spring, before the grasses and the bulbs and things like that started to be available, when the pinon nuts were running out or their stores of acorns were running out. If you were an older person and not well, you might not make it.
European Americans came to the valley in the 1800s. Joseph Rutherford Walker in 1834 is generally credited with being the first. Walker and his men were returning from Monterey to Colorado. They arrived from the west, traveling through the pass that today bears his name, just 5 miles south of Indian Wells. "15 years later, in 1849, came the California Gold Rush. December of that year, some 60 miles east of Indian Wells, a small band of travelers bound for the gold fields became stranded, dangerously low on food and water. Two of the party, William Manley and John Rogers, struck out on foot to get help. The two found their first water at Indian Wells. Manley and Rogers later returned and rescued their comrades from a place they would name Death Valley. Integration of white settlers and Native Americans was occurring throughout California in the 1800s. The process did not always go smoothly, and the region around the Indian Wells Valley was no exception.
And so the Shoshones were rounded up quite often in boxcars and taken out to the lake and made to get into the water, and any of them who tried to swim back, would get shot. And then the other ones who would try to swim out there and keep away from the bullets would end up drowning. And so then, peoples would die, in big groups over and over.
For most of its history, the Indian Wells Valley was a place to go through rather than a place to go to. That was so for the earliest Native people, and for the Walker Party, and for the Manley Party. That transient pattern continued in the 1870s, when Indian Wells was a stopping point for stage and freight wagons traveling back and forth between the rich silver mines in Darwin and Cerro Gordo to the north, and the expanding city of Los Angeles 150 miles to the south. Engineer and historical researcher Tom Chapman owns the ledger book for a stage line that operated from 1870 to 1909.
It seemed like the Mojave and Keeler stage line, from what I can determine in the ledger book, catered more to just general passenger and cargo, whereas, say, Remy Nadeau's freight line was mainly mining supplies, hauling either mining supplies or hauling the silver bullion.
Nadeau's Cerro Gordo Freighting Company ran 80 teams of mules, 14 mules to a wagon, and hauled as much as 18 tons a day of silver from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles by way of Walker Pass. Nadeau's teamsters camped and took on water at Indian Wells. Eventually, a few hardy souls did settle in the valley. In 1874, Freeman S. Raymond opened his stage and freight station south of Indian Wells Station, near a water source known as Coyote Holes. And in 1894, he was granted the first homestead patent in the valley, covering 160 acres around his station. Ranchers and farmers took advantage of the Homestead Act and began to settle in the valley.
Back in those days, if you drilled a well in the Indian Wells Valley proper, you could hit water down not too deep, 40 or 50 feet back then, where the water table was pretty high. So, it's a place for someone to homestead. Property was cheap here.
A few miners began to work the gold and silver deposits in the hills and mountains surrounding the Indian Wells Valley. With increased mining and a growing population on the eastern Sierra, the railroad lines moved in from the south in the early 1900s. Not long after the turn of the century, the Southern Pacific built a spur up through Mojave.
Went up through North China Lake Boulevard up to the White Star Mine, came through that area.
In 1908, something even bigger than the railroad came through the Indian Wells Valley. The Los Angeles Aqueduct.
You have to think of LA, the LA basin after the turn of the century is becoming very populated, just booming in population and industry. It was like a great big virus, just consuming everything around it. And of course, water was the you're next to the ocean and there's plenty of water there, but it's salt water. So these people, they had to get water somewhere. And William Mulholland came up and immediately saw that the Sierras and all that runoff and all that snow and all those creeks was a tremendous source of water, good water, fresh water, clean water, the best water around, and plenty of it.
Mulholland bought up the precious water rights, and construction of the aqueduct began in 1908. The aqueduct still runs along the west edge of the valley, carrying millions of gallons of water south to Los Angeles every day. One stop on the Southern Pacific Railroad line through the Indian Wells Valley was designated Siding 16. A tiny community began to grow there, and the residents soon changed the name from Siding 16 to Magnolia. Siding 17, a little to the north, became the town of Leelighter. And Siding 18, the site of a major aqueduct construction camp, became the town of Brown. When informed by the state in 1913 that the name Magnolia was already taken by a Northern California town, the residents of Siding 16 opted instead for Inyokern. The name denoted the town's proximity to both Inyo and Kern counties. With affordable automobiles came increased tourism, as Southern Californians discovered the desert and the Sierra Nevada. Some people who passed through the Indian Wells Valley decided to stay. Parallel to the former freight line was now a north-south highway. A major road led east to a large chemical plant near Trona in Searles Valley. Near the east side of the Indian Wells Valley, the community of Crumville grew up around a dairy owned by the Crum family. That dairy and several others provided milk for workers and their families in the Trona area. More farmers were moving into the Indian Wells Valley now, and a new Chamber of Commerce was trying to promote growth. When the Great Depression struck the country in the early 1930s, its biggest effect on the Indian Wells Valley was a resurgence of mining activity. Many out-of-work city dwellers decided to seek their fortunes mining gold in the desert.
Well, during the Depression, Marvin Harris told me some stories about, he said they would come up here from LA and Orange County and work in placer and get a little gold enough to supplement their income a little, you know. And he said they found quite a few nuggets in the Summit diggings at that time. But the largest I've ever saw out of there since I've been here was about 30 grams, I believe.
The gold-hungry newcomers built crude structures to shelter themselves from the harsh desert weather.
Usually just a little one-room or two-room cabin. Most of them in here were built where they had a sheet iron roof and sheet iron sides on them.
In 1935, the WPA paved an emergency landing field in Inyokern. In 1939, the Bentham family built a store and service station near Crumville. 2 years later, a post office was set up at Bentham's store, and the community of Crumville was renamed Ridgecrest by popular vote. War came to the nation in 1941, but it had little immediate effect on the Indian Wells Valley. The western Mojave Desert was still quiet and relatively empty. In 1942, when Pat Ferris and her family moved to the valley from Lancaster,
I was 11 now when we moved, and I always remember the little shriveled up heads of lettuce that we'd get from Bentham's Corner because they had this little area where you could buy produce. Bentham's Corner, then when you went toward Inyokern on 178, there wasn't anything there all the way to Anderson's, which was the tavern. That was about the halfway mark.
And so you just basically, you had the handful of homesteaders like the Hank Shooties and the Carrs, John McNeil, Old Man Robertson, the Standards, who homesteaded in the valley and had their little farms out here. And not much else happened until Knott's came around.
in November 1943, Knott's, the Naval Ordnance Test Station, came around with a bang. The valley of farmers, ranchers, and miners was suddenly transformed into the Navy's largest land base, covering more than 1,000 square miles. In later years, the base would be increased by an additional 700 square miles. Remoteness and the harsh climate had always kept the valley's population low. But for the Navy, this large, remote, unpopulated area, complete with railroad access and an airport, was the perfect site for testing aircraft rockets and bombs. When construction began on the base, 8 miles east of Inyokern near a dry lake bed called China Lake, the valley's population suddenly skyrocketed.
It happened so fast, the transition. I mean, it's like you woke up one morning and you were Boomtown, USA. There were people everywhere, and not services.
Inyokern grew from 28 people in November of 1943 to 14,000 a year later. By 1945, the Indian Wells Valley was a madhouse of activity, with people arriving from all over the country.
We came from Torrance. My father was following construction work, and he got a job up here at China Lake on construction.
We came from Ohio because we were looking for a more healthful place to live, and we were broke. We needed work.
Close on the heels of that first wave of construction workers, many of whom stayed on in the valley, came the scientists and engineers who, along with the military staff, would carry out the mission of the base.
Dad came here in '45. He had spent 3 years as a guest of the Japanese. And one of the people he knew from camp got a job here early on and was recruited here and recruited him. And so he came to work as basically as a rocket scientist, worked for Chick Hayward on Hangar 1.
For newcomers, then and now, the first taste of the Mojave Desert usually made a lasting impression.
And we pulled into Inyokern, and if that wasn't a sight, I'll never forget my first look at Inyokern, because here were men walking around with guns on their hips. I mean, this was like something out of the movies.
And of course, when we came here, there's no pavement in Ridgecrest, just all sagebrush and dirt. And my father wouldn't unpack for 6 weeks. He was leaving.
And then he brought Mom up finally about 5 months later. Here was this place that looked like the moon, and she didn't like it. And then she saw the Joshua trees, and she said it reminded her of people with broken spirits that had lost their will to live. You know, they just kind of, their arms and their head was like this, and that even made her more depressed.
And we drove and we drove and we drove, and we finally came up over that last hill and looked down in the valley, and there was what looked like a little village. And we thought, oh, wouldn't that be funny if that was it? It wasn't really funny when it turned out to be it.
So the president of the college went out to the car and talked to my wife a little bit and asked my wife how she was dealing with the wind. It was a windy day and there was dust blowing all over the place. And my wife and I, who were both very motivated to get a job so that I could start a professional life after having suffered in a little one-bedroom apartment in the Hollywood ghetto, said to him, "Wind? What wind?" And I think probably that was one of the factors in terms of why I got the job.
When I just moved to Indiokern, it was very hard to take it at the beginning, but my first impression was being in on vacations, a small city. Well, let's get out of the big city, enjoy a little town and a house in the middle of nothing. So
when I first moved here, the initial shock was real tough. We took my houseplants and put them out so they could get some light, and I found out that in 3 hours, houseplants can actually turn black.
We arrived the last day of July in 1987, and the purpose in coming was to take the position as the public works officer here at Naval Air Weapons Station China Lake. Joking about how unpleasant it was in the desert, and I began to say, well, you know, it's not all that unpleasant. It's actually pretty nice. And we were in July. I thought we'd die, but nah, we didn't die at all. We had nice, long, cool mornings and cool evenings.
I happen to come up here when it's pretty good weather, except for wind, and I don't know, for some reason it got in my blood. I like the area. I'm a nature bug anyhow, and I hate cities. I don't like Ridgecrest, but I love the desert.
Not sure which trip was the first trip, because I came up here with my wife, and she said, no way. We're not going to live in this place, this dust bowl.
When we came looking for apartments, I can remember driving down China Lake Boulevard and realizing, wow, this is a lot bigger than I expected. And that was somewhat of a relief, because we didn't really know what we were getting ourselves into at that point. But
we had a very positive attitude when we came here, because we liked the sunshine and the warmth. It was just the sunshine and the warmth that particular February.
The Navy's virtual takeover of the valley in the 1940s did not sit well with everyone. When the government established knots, some 1,800 mining claims had been swallowed up in the process. Local miners grumbled that the money they were paid by the government in compensation for the loss of their mining claims was inadequate. Outrage boiled over when federal mineral examiners investigated more than 1,000 mining claims in the Indiokern area, and then invalidated more than 4 out of 5. But for the vast majority of Indian Wells Valley inhabitants in the 1940s and 50s, the base at China Lake was the center of their lives. The scientists, engineers, technicians, and military people who worked at Knott's were devoted to the base and its mission.
I can remember Joe going to work many a morning at 6 o'clock or thereabouts so that he could call Washington, because, you know, you go in later and you couldn't, because of the time difference, it makes it very difficult to call Washington. I think people were very dedicated, the work they did on the base. Hours didn't mean anything. You know, I mean, it was getting the job done, and people worked and didn't look at it like a 9-to-5 job. The early days of the base, you were still in a world war, and people were very conscious of needing the weapons and how important that was.
There was a short period of time that there was fear that we might actually lose the war. And so they had to get busy and get doing what they were doing and get about. And when they found this place, they just rolled up their sleeves and people worked day and night.
Certainly a great deal of satisfaction when the thing you're working on, you can actually see whether it works. And if it doesn't work, well, that's a great deal of impetus to make sure that it does. Standing there in front of your buddies. When it's 3,000 miles away, you can easily say, ah, well, who cares, somebody else's fault.
The weapons that were designed and built at China Lake usually did work, and the base soon established a track record for performance that was the envy of the Air Force, Army, and the private defense industry. The hard work of designing, building, and testing weapons was complemented by a vibrant social life.
It was a real community, and you knew everyone, and there were clubs and parties, and Friday night at the officers' club was just you know, there was always a dance with a live band, special dinners. There was a lot of social activity going on. It was people that we knew that didn't live here were amazed at our social life because it was very active.
There was nothing here. People had to make their own lives. They had to join together in groups to have some companionship and some cultural kinds of things. So there were probably more clubs and organizations here than any place in the world.
Well, for recreation, we did a lot of partying. We went to dance at Anderson's. It was halfway between here and Inyokern. They had a wooden floor there, and you could feel that floor giving as you danced. Of course, all the military had their dances. Military and the engineers had their dances at the officers' club. But we had to go to Anderson's to dance to music. It was Western music, and we all loved it.
For children, the valley was a great place to be in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s.
For entertainment, well, we would go down to the Ridge Theater. That was down on what is now China Lake Boulevard, off of Balsam. And we would go lizard hunting and catch horny toads, jump the sagebrush. We would go down to Hazelton's department store and count buttons. That was down on the corner of Ridgecrest Boulevard and China Lake Boulevard, where JD's is now. Then we would go over to the furniture store that Jimmy and Millie Rezzardini owned, and we'd walk around the furniture store. And we would sit on all the furniture till they run us out of there.
I came along in 1949, born in Ridgecrest Hospital. And then We all were raised up there. It was wonderful living on the base back in the 50s. The place was like an oasis. We started out, he would take me, right around the time I was about 5 years old, he'd take me arrowhead hunting, usually to the El Paso Mountains south of town, Sheep Springs in that area. And so we would go up on, in the nice time of year, we would go up to up Mountain Springs Canyon and up to Bircham Springs or Junction Ranch or the Petroglyphs or Coso Peak, those areas.
We actually did have a lot of freedom. The community was closed. Everybody knew everybody. Roved in packs that were about, age specific. I can remember summertime, long as I can remember, hitting the desert as soon as it was light and not coming home until we were late for dinner. We could go a long way. There was always stuff to mess with and always stuff to find, and we could do a lot of things kids can't do now. I can remember sitting on the aprons on the runway and watching airplanes take off over our heads, and that was in the 60s, and there was a lot of it. And eventually somebody would report us, and then ops or whoever would send a van out with a sailor, and they'd pick us up and take us home.
For many years, a rift existed between those who lived aboard China Lake and those who lived outside the base. In the earliest days of Knott's, it was not a troublesome issue. Both the base and the off-base community, mainly the booming towns of Ridgecrest and Inyokern, shared the same hardships. Very few goods and services could be found locally.
There was no shopping available. You couldn't buy clothes. You couldn't even bank locally. You had to bank in Mojave.
But as China Lake developed, the base rapidly became more self-sufficient, and most of the civilians who worked at Knott's also lived on the base.
When we moved over on the base, it seemed like the base was a community all in its own. We had the theater, of course, was there. And we had the commissary and the Navy Exchange, and we did all our shopping. And once in a while, you would go out in town to a market, but it was very rare because we were more or less, you just stayed on the base. You didn't go out in town and socialize with a lot of the people out there, believe it or not. It was just kind of, we were like two complete separate communities.
I can remember in the 60s when folks who lived on base tended to, I think, to a certain extent, think of the people who lived off base as somehow second-class citizens. These are people who couldn't use the commissary of the exchange. Basically, we never left the base, that was kind of, nobody ever left the base.
And when they did leave the base, it was generally not to shop in town, but to spend hours driving to the larger cities of Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Palmdale, Lancaster, or Bakersfield.
The only thing that I can remember as a kid that I ever thought about, schismatically, if you will, was there was a differentiation between people who lived on board in Ridgecrest. Not very many people lived in Ridgecrest.
Matters came to a head in 1953 when the Ridgecrest Chamber of Commerce petitioned Washington to have the base commissary and exchange closed to civilians.
People at one time decided, well, they were just going to boycott everything in Ridgecrest. The groceries were quite a bit cheaper, and the Navy Exchange quite a bit larger at the time. And they would shop there, or else they would go out of town, and they just flat refused to go out in town because of the tension. People just didn't want to have anything to do with you if you lived on the base.
That crisis passed, but the two communities remained distinct. Then, as the years passed, rents and utilities began to rise on the base. Commissary privileges for civilians were terminated. FHA mortgages and increased home building outside the gate combined to draw the civilian workforce out into the valley, and local business began to pick up.
The exodus didn't really occur until, I'd say it started late 60s and then really accelerated drastically and dramatically in the 70s, early 70s.
People had what they needed on the base. They didn't need to come to Ridgecrest. And so when they began to need to come to Ridgecrest and they began to live here and began to participate in the services, I think it really made it more one community.
Today, the entire civilian workforce and most of the military live outside the base, in homes of every size and style. Despite the presence of many locally developed businesses, as well as several major national retailers, the issue of where to shop is still a somewhat touchy subject.
I think the mentality here still, to this day, is people like to spend their money out of town. They just never have really gotten a grasp on trying to, or really felt like they were committed to helping the local businesses out.
In the Coso Mountains, which rim the north end of the Indian Wells Valley, lie the Coso Hot Springs.
Some of the elders, they told me that when they was little kids, like Harold Bevers, he said when he was younger, he said that his parents used to drive out there. They had a Model T, and on the way out, they used to work in the mines out there. And when they on their way out to the mines, they stop off at Coso, and the sand right next to the springs would be boiling. The sand would boil, and they'd put their pot of beans on the sand, and then toward the end of the day, they'd come back, and the beans would be cooked up.
Back in those days, you could go up to virtually anywhere up in the North Ranges except Coso Hot Springs because it was considered to be dangerous.
A health spa operated at Coso from about 1910 until after the Navy takeover. Mud and water from the springs were believed to have medicinal benefits. But there was another important dimension to Coso Hot Springs. They are the surface manifestation of a huge geothermal field. In the 1930s, some far-sighted individuals saw in Coso the potential for energy development. The vision became reality in the 1980s, when the Navy oversaw development of a massive geothermal plant at Coso.
It sure is a great day. I'm Captain Ken Kelly, the Public Works Officer, and your Master Ceremonies for today.
Ken Kelly, who later became the Ridgecrest City Administrator, was head of China Lake's Public Works Department when the first Coso geothermal power plant went online.
Dr. Carl Austin was in the Public Works Department at the time, and he was the kind of the father of the geothermal power plants in this area. He's the one that had the vision many years ago. I'd been reading about it and never really dreamed I'd come and be a part of it.
The idea of developing COSO for geothermal energy did not originate with me. H.N. Siegfried, an engineer for Southern Sierras Power Company, now Southern Cal Edison, in 1925 said about COSO, and I quote, "There is no doubt that a survey will disclose ample land still free for entry that will be suitable for natural steam development purposes." What did originate with me was the idea that the COSO geothermal system could be developed to further the Navy mission at China Lake.
By the turn of the 21st century, the COSO geothermal plant was producing more than 250 megawatts of power, enough for more than 1 million households. Over the past century, the population of the Indian Wells Valley has grown from perhaps a few hundred individuals to more than 30,000. Most of the valley's residents today live in or near Ridgecrest. As Ridgecrest grew, so did city government. Mary Adler worked as an accountant for Ridgecrest in 1963.
At that time, the City Hall was a little tiny, tiny place. The City Hall consisted of the front office, which was big enough for 2 desks, for the secretary and for the accountant, and for the, then there was an office for the city administrator.
Ridgecrest was formally incorporated in 1963, and the current City Hall was built in 1989 at a cost of $13 million. In 2004, the Ridgecrest budget was more than $9 million. The issue of growth, how much, how fast, and what type, has long been a source of controversy in the valley. It came to a head in the early 1990s against the backdrop of budgetary reductions at China Lake.
And then with the defense budget cuts in the early 90s, Ridgecrest almost became a ghost town. I think I heard where at one time there were 650 homes on the market. And of course, if you drove around downtown Ridgecrest, it was pretty depressing. You know, every other place was vacant. For rent signs were hanging everywhere.
In 1992, as local leaders scrambled to attract non-defense related businesses, the community became polarized over a proposal to site a new state prison in the valley.
I was president-elect and then president of the chamber at the time. It was a very negative time. There was a lot of lines drawn in the sand and hateful things said on both sides. People were both for and against the prison.
I'm really sorry to see that they never let the prison come in. I feel that would have been an asset to our community.
No prisons.
In general, for instance, with prisons, they need to go somewhere, and if everyone says not in my backyard, then they're never going to go anywhere.
You've got bright kids that go to college and come home and want to live here, and they can't get a job making anything but minimum wage. And that prison could have provided some well-paying jobs.
I think it would be very sad to see this place centered on a prison or a rendering plant, or something incredibly stupid that's going to destroy the water supply of the valley in short order. I think that's something we have to be very aware of, that a giant water park is probably not appropriate for the middle of the Mojave Desert.
I'm not against growth to a certain extent, but I also think that we have to look at our groundwater. We have to look at our resources and whether we're able to support growth here. And I'm not sure how much more growth we can support.
Bank manager Solomon Raj reflects the concerns of many who believe the community is too dependent on a single economic engine, the base at China Lake.
I'd like to have more manufacturing industries coming into the town, and then providing them with better facilities, as you said, like golf courses.
I hope it doesn't become like Palm Springs. I don't want to see the golf courses because they take too much water.
I would really like to see a golf course put in out here in town.
Well, I think we should be open to just anything, open to whatever might want to come in here. And as I say, we cannot stay a small town or just a village anymore. It's getting to be a good-sized community.
Yeah, I think there should be a limit, because if it gets too big, then some of the people who like living in a small town might leave, because they just want to live in a small, quiet town.
I keep saying we need a Trader Joe's, because between me and my two friends, we keep them open. Bring on the cheese.
It's a pretty decent size. I wouldn't want it to get too big because I wouldn't want to have any more traffic or things of that nature. It's awfully nice to have a Home Depot now.
On some level, you know, I think that the growth is good, but then on some other level, I hope it doesn't get too damn big, you know. You know, I mean, you know, it's like Bishop. Gosh, man, you can't hardly get down the street anymore up there, you know.
I've had plenty of people, you know, come clean and say, I left the big city because of smog or because of crime or whatever it is they were trying to get away from that we don't have here. We don't have the many big city issues here. And from talking to them, I've surmised that a lot of us probably wouldn't want it to get to be big, that we'd start having those issues to deal with. It's a very intelligent community. I'm sure we can handle whatever happens, but I think we kind of like it the way it is.
But what defines the way it is? For many residents in the valley, the answer seems to involve people helping people.
When I first came here, everybody in our class, they became friends with me, and they taught me like how to play basketball and other sports and everything. I just want to become a pediatrician because I want to come back to town and start a practice here, because we don't have those many pediatricians here, and if we had more, it'd be better for everybody.
We had a child that came along, and we certainly recognized that this community had tremendous value in terms of being a place where it was relatively safe and sane for a child to be raised. There's an excellent and very committed group of people who volunteer their time for coaching, for example.
Habitat for Humanity is an ecumenical Christian ministry that builds houses with God's people in need. This year we have 4 houses under construction. It's all religions and no religions. Some of our best volunteers are people who have, are atheists. The thing that brings the people together in this program is the desire to help other people. People have a good time doing something that helps somebody else, and you just can't beat it for a warm feeling of accomplishment.
when we first got to town, our U-Haul, that is, bringing the furniture and what have you from Palmdale, our next door neighbors, Bud and Carol Sewell, came to the U-Haul truck and started helping us move items from the truck into the house. I think they did that before they even said hello. It was just what they did.
People come to me, and that gives me the opportunity to pay back what I got when I just moved to this country. Like, people don't know where to go. Well, if I don't know, I have the chance to find out and help them out a little bit. You give a little bit, and these people in return also give something back to somebody else that is in the community. That's why I think it's very important, because we all help each other.
To skiers on their way to the Eastern Sierra resorts, the Indian Wells Valley is still just a place on the way to someplace else. But to the people of the valley, this is someplace. It's a place to begin a family, a place to start a business, a place for helping, a place of hope, and a place to simply enjoy life.
I had a friend once that talked about coming up to Ridgecrest to watch the sunrise on the Sierras. Well, I watch the sunrise on the Sierras every day.